They came at dawn in numbers no man could count, and before the sun touched the mesas, some said a lonely rancher would be crowned. Elias Boone did not believe in prophecy, only weather, horses, and the stubborn honesty of hard ground. For 12 years he had worked a spread of dry pasture near Red Mesa, where dust moved like ghosts and wind sang through broken fence posts. Men in town called him quiet, some called him forgotten, but the desert keeps strange accounts, and sometimes a single act can wake an old debt buried deeper than gold. It began on an afternoon hot enough to shimmer the horizon. Elias was riding the North Ridge checking a split water line when he saw smoke rise from the canyon below, dark and unnatural against the blue. At first he thought lightning had struck cedar scrub. Then he heard it, faint through the wind, not the cry of an animal, but a human voice carried sharp as a hawk's call. He spurred his horse downslope, gravel scattering under iron shoes, and the heat met him before he reached the ravine. Fire moved low through dry brush, rolling in orange sheets, feeding on old timber and summer grass. In the middle of it stood a young Apache woman, trapped near a fallen cottonwood, clutching a small leather box against her chest as flames circled closer. Elias never stopped to think. Some men weigh danger. Others step into it before fear has time to speak. He wrapped his coat over his arm, pushed through smoke, and reached her just as burning limbs cracked above them. Her dark eyes met his, steady despite the chaos, and for a strange second the world went still. She did not scream. She did not plead. She only held tighter to that carved box as if all nations rested inside it. Elias lifted her and led her through heat and drifting ash while the fire roared around them like a living storm. When they reached open ground, both fell to the red dirt breathing hard. His hands stung. Her dress was scorched at the hem. Yet she looked not frightened, but watchful, as though measuring something invisible. Then she spoke in careful English, voice low as wind through sage. "My father will come." Elias almost smiled at that. Out here fathers came with rifles or questions, not promises. But before he could answer, she pressed a turquoise token into his palm, rose despite the smoke, and vanished toward the stone bluffs with the leather box still held close. He watched until the canyon swallowed her. That night the ranch sat too quiet. Even the horses seemed restless. Elias turned the turquoise over in lamplight, noticing symbols cut into the stone older than any county map. He wondered if he had rescued a wanderer, or stepped into a story much older than his own. Near midnight, he heard distant hoofbeats, then silence. At dawn, when he opened the cabin door, riders stood across the valley in still formation, more than 20 at first, then more appearing through dust until the earth itself seemed lined with horses. No one moved. No one reached for a weapon. At their center sat a broad-shouldered elder wrapped in dark buckskin, silver in his braids, watching Elias as if he had been expected for years. And what the old chief carried across his saddle was not tribute, nor threat, but the beginning of a kingdom. The elder dismounted without hurry, boots touching the dust as softly as falling ash. The riders behind him remained still, their silence heavier than thunder. Elias stood in his doorway with the turquoise token in one hand and every old frontier warning rising in his chest. Yet nothing in the old chief's face carried threat, carried measure. The elder stepped forward and held out an object wrapped in deer hide. Elias expected a weapon. Instead, he found a carved wooden staff no longer than a rifle barrel, polished smooth by generations of hands. Turquoise stones ran along its length, catching the dawn. The chief spoke in English worn by age but clear as spring water. "My daughter Ayana told me a white rancher entered fire when others would have turned away." Elias glanced toward the riders, then toward the valley beyond them where sunlight spilled over red stone walls. "I only did what any man should do," he answered. The old chief studied him for a long moment and gave the slightest smile. "That is what rare men always say." He raised one weathered hand, and the line of riders parted. Through them came Ayana, riding a painted mare, unburned now, dark hair braided with silver thread, the leather box resting across her lap. She looked different in morning light, less like someone rescued and more like someone carrying purpose older than either of them. When she stopped beside her father, she lifted the box and placed it into Elias's hands. The leather felt warm despite the cool dawn. "Open it," she said. Inside lay not gold, but a folded map painted on deer skin, showing valleys, springs, grazing lands, and mountain passes stretching farther than Elias could ride in a week. He looked up in confusion. The chief touched the map. "This is what settlers call empty wilderness. My people call it the living kingdom." Then came the impossible offer. The old man said the Council of 7 Clans had agreed to grant Elias stewardship over one sacred valley, a place where no outsider had ever held claim, if he would stand as ally and protector in coming troubles. Elias almost laughed from disbelief. He owned a weathered cabin, a few head of cattle, and debt at the mercantile. Kingdoms belonged in Bible stories and fever dreams. Yet the chief's eyes never shifted. This was no metaphor. It was covenant. Still Elias sensed something beneath the offer, some test not yet named. "Why me?" he asked. "Why trust a rancher you met at dawn?" Ayanna answered before her father could. "Because a man reveals himself in the moment before he has time to calculate profit. You stepped into fire with no witness. That is how character shows itself." Her words settled deeper than he wished. Behind them the riders dismounted one by one and drove lances upright into the earth, forming a silent ring. It looked less like ceremony than judgment. Then the chief spoke again. "Before any man may receive a kingdom, he must prove he can carry one. There are 3 tests: mercy, truth, sacrifice. Pass them and what is offered is yours. Fail, and the valley returns to wind and memory." Elias felt the old world tilt under his boots. He had expected gratitude. Instead, dawn had brought a trial. And just as he opened his mouth to answer, a distant dust cloud rose from the southern road, moving fast toward the ranch. Anna turned sharply toward it. Her calm broke for the first time. "The settlers have come sooner than I feared," she whispered. And Elias Boone realized the first test had already begun. The dust cloud rolled closer in long pale ribbons, and soon Elias could make out wagons, riders, and the brass glint of survey instruments catching morning light. Landmen, speculators, the kind who measured a valley before they ever learned its name. Chief Takota did not move, but his gaze hardened as old granite. Ayanna leaned toward Elias and spoke low enough only he could hear. "Mercy is never tested when dealing with friends. It is tested when greed arrives smiling." The wagon stopped 100 yards from the ranch, and from the lead carriage stepped Horace Bellamy, a railroad investor whose polished boots had never known trail dust until profit demanded it. Elias had met him once in town and trusted him less than drought. Bellamy removed his gloves and looked first at the Apache riders, then at Elias, then at the deer skin map in his hands. His expression changed in a way that told Elias too much had just been revealed. "Mr. Boone," Bellamy called, forcing cheer into his voice, "I came to discuss a fair purchase of this range. Instead, I find a gathering fit for kings." Elias said nothing. Some silences carry more warning than speech. Bellamy continued, speaking as if offering generosity. "A rail line may soon pass through these mesas. There are fortunes under these hills. Copper, perhaps silver. Men will flood this territory. You can either profit from progress or be buried under it." Chief Takota watched without interruption, allowing the moment to reveal itself. Then Bellamy did something curious. He pointed not to the ranch, but toward the sacred valley marked on Elias's map. "We have heard of springs hidden there," he said. "Water enough to feed a new town." Elias felt the first shape of the test rise before him. Mercy was not softness. Mercy might mean refusing to let ambition devour what it did not understand. Bellamy stepped closer. "Sell me access, Boone. Name a figure. I can make you wealthier than any cattleman in Arizona territory." The old hunger of men was all in his voice. Gold without labor, power without belonging. Elias looked down at his rough hands, scarred from rope burns and seasons of drought. Then he folded the map and handed it back to Ayanna. "This land is not mine to sell," he said. Bellamy smiled as though humoring a child. Every land has an owner if the price is right. That was when Chief Dakota finally spoke. Some things are measured by honor, not purchase. The words drifted calm as evening smoke, but they unsettled the air. Bellamy's men shifted uneasily. He laughed, though too quickly. Then perhaps the rancher should prove his honor by choosing progress over superstition. Elias saw the trap clearly now. Mercy did not ask him to defeat a rival. It asked him to resist turning another man into an enemy. So he stepped forward and surprised them all. "You may water your horses at my well before you leave," he told Bellamy. "You will be treated fair. But this valley will not be sold through me." Even Dakota seemed to study him anew. Bellamy's face tightened. Hospitality had denied him the conflict he expected. He mounted without another word, but before turning his horse he said something colder than anger. "Then I will return with papers signed by men in Washington. And maps care little for old legends." The wagons rolled away in dust. Silence lingered. Then Dakota nodded once. "Mercy," he said, "is strongest when it refuses humiliation." One test passed, but Ayanna was still watching the southern horizon, troubled. Because beyond the fading wagons, another rider approached alone at full gallop, carrying a black flag tied beneath his saddle horn. And when Dakota saw it, even the old chief whispered, "Truth comes sooner than expected." The lone rider came hard through the dust, horse lathered, hat gone, his coat flapping loose behind him. He did not slow until he reached the ring of Apache lances, where he dismounted so abruptly his boots slid in the dirt. The black cloth tied beneath his saddle horn stirred in the morning wind like morning crepe. Elias had seen such cloth once before outside a mining camp after a cave-in. It did not announce death. It announced warning. The rider was young, maybe 20, with the hard breathing of a man who had outrun bad news. He bowed first to Chief Dakota, then turned to Ayanna and placed in her hands a folded paper sealed with red wax. Elias noticed at once it was not tribal work. It bore the mark of the territorial governor. Ayanna broke the seal and read, and for the first time since the fire, her face lost its stillness. She handed the letter to her father. Dakota read slowly, eyes narrowing. Then he passed it to Elias. The paper stated that, within 30 days, federal surveyors intended to claim the Sacred Valley for military road construction under a treaty no Apache elder had signed. Elias read it twice, each line colder than the last. Bellamy had not been boasting. He had moved pieces long before riding to the ranch. Truth, Elias thought. This must be the second trial. Not whether a man can speak honestly, but whether he can face a truth he does not want. Dakota looked toward the valley ridges, where morning light now touched the stone in pale gold bands. "A kingdom may be offered," he said quietly, "but first it must survive theft." The young rider then added something worse. There was another name attached to the order. Elias Boone. Elias felt the earth drop under him. "My name?" The rider nodded. Someone had filed papers claiming Elias as intermediary willing to transfer access rights. Bellamy had forged his consent. A lie wearing his face. Ayanna stepped close enough for Elias to hear only her. Truth tests whether a man protects his name or protects what truth demands beyond his name. The distinction unsettled him. In town, a forged paper could ruin a man. Yet Dakota watched him not with suspicion, but expectation. Then the old chief said the second test plainly. "Ride to Silver Creek by sundown. Stand before the magistrate who stamped this fraud. Speak the truth knowing powerful men may turn against you." Elias almost laughed at the cruelty of fate. Yesterday he had been mending fence posts. Today he was asked to challenge men tied to governors and railroads. But some callings arrive before courage does. He saddled his bay horse while Ayanna brought the leather box once more. She opened it, revealing beneath old cloth a silver medallion engraved with a sunburst. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said. "Carriers of this token were once granted safe passage among 7 clans." She placed it in Elias's hand. "It is lent, not given. Return it only if you return with your name intact." Their eyes held a moment longer than either intended. No romance lay in it. Something older. Recognition. Elias mounted. Yet just before he rode out, Takota called after him. Remember this. Truth is not proven by winning an argument. It is proven by what a man refuses to sell of himself. Elias turned south toward Silver Creek, hooves striking dry earth in steady rhythm. By noon heat shimmered over the flats, and the town church steeple appeared far off. But as he neared the first cottonwoods by the creek crossing, he saw Bellamy's carriage already outside the courthouse. And beside it, tied at the hitching rail, stood a second horse Elias knew too well, the sheriff's mount, which meant Bellamy had not come alone. And Elias Boone understood the second test was not waiting inside the courthouse. It had been arranged before he ever arrived. Silver Creek looked smaller than Elias remembered, as if truth itself made old places shrink. The courthouse stood whitewashed and severe at the end of Main Street, its porch crowded with men pretending not to watch him arrive. Bellamy leaned near the entrance speaking quietly with Sheriff Hollis, a broad man whose smile had always carried too much calculation. Elias tied his horse, dusted the road from his sleeves, and walked forward with the silver medallion hidden inside his vest. He had expected accusation. What unsettled him was courtesy. Bellamy greeted him warmly, almost as a friend. Mr. Boone, perfect timing. We were just discussing how misunderstandings become troublesome when left unattended. Elias heard the trap in the softness. Sheriff Hollis nodded toward the magistrate's office. Best clear matters civilly. No need for conflict. Yet every eye on the porch avoided his. Men avoid looking directly at a lie when they have agreed to share it. Inside, the courthouse smelled of ink, old cedar, and summer heat trapped in plaster walls. Judge Mercer sat behind a scarred oak desk, spectacles. Low on his nose, papers already arranged. Too arranged. Bellamy produced the forged land petition and slid it forward. Your signature appears here, Boone. The magistrate asked if Elias denied consenting to survey rights. A simple question, but Elias felt its weight. If he answered only for himself, he might save his name and lose the valley. If he spoke fully, he would accuse men stronger than him. That was the shape of the second trial. Truth rarely arrives clean. It demands cost. Elias touched the medallion beneath his shirt and remembered Takota's words. A man proves truth by what he refuses to sell of himself. Then he spoke, voice plain as fence wire. That signature is false, and the land in question was never mine to bargain away. Bellamy smiled thinly. Sentimental confusion. Frontier lands shift ownership every year. Elias looked at the judge. Then write this plainly in your record. Those survey claims are based on deceit, and the railroad seeks water rights by fraud. The room chilled though the windows stood open. Hollis shifted at once. Careful, Boone. Accusing investors is no small matter. Elias turned to him. Neither is stealing a valley under forged names. For a long moment nobody moved. Even the fly buzzing at the window seemed too loud. Then something unexpected happened. Judge Mercer removed his spectacles and studied Elias with a tired expression older than office. Years ago, he said slowly, I rode through those same mesas with an Apache guide who saved my life in a flood. Men forget debts. Paper should not help them do so. He took up the forged petition, drew his pen through its approval mark, and stamped it void. Bellamy's face hardened for the first time. You make an enemy of progress, Judge. Mercer answered without looking up. No, I delay thieves for one afternoon. Truth had spoken through an old man Elias barely knew. Yet before relief could settle, Hollis stepped near and laid a folded telegram on the desk. Another order had arrived by wire. Federal commissioners would review all territorial claims within 3 days at Red Mesa itself. Bellamy smiled again, but colder now. Then let the final matter be settled where the valley lies. Outside, as Elias stepped back into sun glare, townsfolk who had watched from porches said nothing, though 2 old ranchers tipped their hats almost imperceptibly. Small gestures. Sometimes history turns on smaller things. Elias mounted to ride back, believing the second trial passed. But near the creek crossing, he found Ayanna waiting beneath cottonwoods, though he had told no one his route. Her mare stood motionless as stone. "You carry truth in your face," she said. "But why do you look troubled?" Elias told her of the federal hearing. She listened, then said something that stopped his breath. "Because the third test was never sacrifice of land. It is sacrifice of what you most want to keep." Before Elias could ask what she meant, she pointed toward the horizon where smoke rose from the direction of his ranch. Smoke lifted in a dark ribbon against the late afternoon sky, and Elias did not wait for explanation. He and Ayanna turned their horses north and rode hard across the flats, Sage brushing their stirrups, sun dropping lower over the mesas in copper light. Neither spoke for miles. Some silences belong to fear. Others belong to understanding too large for words. When Elias crested the final ridge above his ranch, he reined in sharply. The cabin still stood. The smoke rose from his outer barn where hay had been set smoldering. Not enough to destroy, enough to warn. A message written in ash. Several Apache riders were already there with Chief Takota, studying the ground. Elias dismounted and saw wagon tracks leading away toward the southern road. Bellamy had not struck to ruin property. He had struck to make a point. Ayanna knelt by the dirt and touched one boot print. "They wanted you to rush back and abandon the hearing in 3 days," she said. "To force your choice through fear." Takota looked at Elias for a long while, then said the words Elias had been resisting. "Sacrifice has arrived." Elias expected the third trial to demand risk of life or land. Instead, Takota gestured toward the ranch itself, the weathered cabin Elias had built board by board after losing his family years ago. "If federal commissioners come, they will use your ownership claim to seize the valley. Through you. The only way to break that chain is if you no longer hold this ranch." Elias stared at him. "No longer hold it." Takota nodded. "Give it away before sunrise. Relinquish what anchors your old life." Elias felt something tighten in his chest harder than any threat Bellamy had made. This cabin was not timber and nails. It was memory. His father's saddle hung inside. His mother's Bible lay by the bed. Every fence line held years of labor. A kingdom had seemed abstract. This loss was real. And now he understood why sacrifice is the final test. It asks not for what is spare, but for what you love. Night settled slow while they sat by a small fire outside the cabin. Coyotes called far off. Sparks drifted upward. Elias turned the silver medallion in his hand and finally asked what had lingered unspoken. "If I surrender the ranch, what remains of me?" Takota answered without hesitation. "Perhaps the part not built from possessions." Ayanna added softly, "Sometimes what a man keeps can imprison him more than what he loses." Before dawn, Elias made his choice. At first light, he saddled his horse and rode to the neighboring widow, Mrs. Eleanor Pike, whose son had died in winter and whose land was failing. In a dusty kitchen smelling of coffee and cedar smoke, Elias signed over his ranch deed for $1 and a promise she keep the well open to travelers of any people. The old woman wept without understanding fully why. Elias only said, "Some homes serve better when they stop belonging to one man." When he rode back, the Apache riders stood in a half-circle waiting. Takota took the deed, fed a corner of its copy into the fire, and watched smoke rise. "The third test is met," he said. Yet Elias felt no triumph, only strange emptiness. Then Ayanna handed him back the leather box. Inside, beneath the map, lay a second parchment he had never seen. A treaty drafted generations earlier, offering alliance between 7 clans and 1 outsider protector, and signed for 50 years because no worthy man had come. Elias looked up stunned. Was this always the kingdom? Takota almost smiled. "You thought a kingdom meant possession. It means burden accepted freely." But before the moment could settle, a rider burst from the eastern ridge carrying news that froze every face. Federal commissioners had moved the hearing forward to tomorrow at dawn, and Horace Bellamy had arrived at the Sacred Valley already, bringing survey crews into the Spring Canyon. Elias understood then sacrifice had only opened the gate. The kingdom itself still had to be defended without a single shot fired. They rode through the night beneath a moon thin as a silver spur, horses breathing steam in the cooling desert air. No one spoke much. Even Bellamy's name seemed too small for what was moving toward dawn. By first light, Elias and the Apache riders reached the sacred valley, and what he saw stopped him cold. Survey flags stood planted among cottonwoods near the spring, bright scraps of red cloth marking land as if paper could command water older than nations. Wagons ringed the meadow. Men with chains and tripods moved in measured lines. At their center stood Federal Commissioner Harlan in a dark coat despite the heat, reading from documents while Bellamy watched with satisfied stillness. Yet something else held Elias's eye. Along the valley ridges, Apache families had gathered in silence. Elders, mothers, children, riders. Not a war line, a witness line. Takota leaned near Elias and said, "Remember, a kingdom defended by force becomes another conquest. Defend it by truth." Commissioner Harlan called the hearing to order under open sky. Bellamy presented maps, mineral claims, projected rail routes, all the language men use when they wish greed to sound civilized. Then Harlan turned to Elias. "As named intermediary, do you affirm transfer rights over these lands?" Every eye in the valley seemed to rest on one answer. Elias stepped forward into morning light and removed from his coat the ranch deed signed away for $1. "I hold no property to transfer," he said. "Yesterday I surrendered my claim. The basis of this petition is void." Murmurs moved through settlers and surveymen alike. Bellamy recovered quickly. A theatrical gesture. Ownership can be reacquired. Progress does not wait on sentiment. Then Elias did something none expected. He asked permission to submit one final document. From the leather box, he drew the old alliance treaty and handed it to Harlan. The commissioner studied the faded signatures, brows tightening. "This predates territorial annexation," he said softly. "It recognizes tribal stewardship and an outside protector role under federal precedent." Bellamy stepped in sharply. An antique curiosity. Irrelevant. But before Harlan could answer, a new voice rose from behind the settlers. Judge Mercer had arrived, riding through dust with 2 clerks and county records strapped in leather satchels. "I brought forgotten filings," he announced. Water rights registered in this valley were protected under earlier treaty law and never lawfully extinguished. Bellamy's certainty flickered for the first time. Yet the true turn came from somewhere smaller. A ranch widow stepped forward from the gathered onlookers. Eleanor Pike. Then 2 old cattlemen Elias had seen on the courthouse porch joined her. Then more settlers. One by one they testified that Elias had signed away his ranch openly, that Bellamy's forged petition had been known in rumor, that water in the Sacred Valley fed half the drought routes in bad summers. Truth, once spoken, was breeding courage. Harlan removed his hat and stood silent for a long moment beside the spring. Then he drove Bellamy's survey flag from the ground and laid it flat. By authority vested in this commission, he declared these claims suspended and the valley recognized under protected stewardship pending permanent ratification. No cheers rose. Only wind through cottonwood leaves. Somehow silence made it grander. Bellamy stared as though unable to comprehend losing without a shot fired. He turned toward Elias and said bitterly, "You have thrown away a ranch for land you do not even own." Elias answered almost gently, "That was the lesson. It was never mine to own." Takota looked at him then with something close to pride. "The kingdom has chosen," he said. Yet as commissioners packed their papers and settlers drifted back, Ayanna touched Elias's arm and pointed toward the spring. In the shallow water, reflected beside the cottonwoods, stood 7 old stone markers Elias had never noticed. Takota whispered, "Now you must hear why your name was spoken in our prophecies before you were born." And Elias realized the greatest twist of all had not yet been told. The 7 stone markers stood half-hidden beneath cottonwood shade, worn by centuries of wind, each carved with a sunburst like the medallion Elias still carried. Water moved around their bases in slow, clear ribbons, making the symbols shimmer. Chief Takota stepped toward them and placed his palm on the tallest stone. Long before railroads, before forts, before border lines cut the desert, 7 clans made covenant here, he said. When war threatened to consume all peoples, a stranger from another bloodline gave up his homestead to keep peace among them. Since then, elders kept a prophecy that when the valley was threatened again, Another outsider would come not by conquest but by sacrifice. Elias almost objected. Prophecy was for preachers and old legends, not ranch hands with worn boots. But Ayanna opened the leather box one final time and drew out a yellowed page folded beneath the treaty. It was a journal leaf written in English, dated 52 years earlier. Elias read slowly, and the breath left him. The signature at the bottom was Jonah Boone, his grandfather, a man Elias had been told died chasing silver in Nevada. Dakota watched the realization strike. He did not chase silver, the chief said. He kept peace in this valley and vanished so your family would survive hatred from both sides. The kingdom offered today was once entrusted to your blood. It was never reward. It was return. Elias stared at the old ink until memory rearranged itself. His father's silences. The strange Apache beadwork once kept in a drawer. Things dismissed as frontier oddities now stood like clues hiding in plain sight. Ayanna smiled faintly. Sometimes destiny wears the face of forgotten family history. Yet before Elias could absorb the weight of it, Dakota called the gathered riders and settlers toward the spring. Men Elias had known all his life stood beside Apache elders in one uneasy circle. Commissioner Harlan remained too, hat in hand, as if sensing history larger than law. Then Dakota did something none expected. He removed the silver medallion from Elias's hand and hung it again around his neck, not as a loan, but as inheritance restored. He raised his voice so all could hear. The kingdom promised is not land, nor title, nor hidden wealth. It is guardianship of peace between peoples who forgot they need each other. Then one by one, the riders stepped forward and planted their lances in the meadow. Not in challenge, in pledge. Even the settlers watched in silence. Ayanna moved beside Elias and whispered, "In our way, this is coronation. No crown, only burden shared." Elias felt almost unworthy. "I am no chief," he said quietly. Dakota answered with a softness deeper than command. "Good. Men who seek crowns should never wear them." As the sun lowered, Harlan announced permanent recognition proceedings would begin, but his words now sounded almost secondary. Something older had already been ratified without paper. Yet a final turn remained. Eleanor Pike approached carrying the deed Elias had given away. She pressed it back into his hands. "The ranch is yours still," she said. "I held it only until your test was met." Elias looked from the deed to Dakota, confused. The old chief laughed, a rare rough sound. "Did you think sacrifice means permanent loss? Sometimes it means proving you can let go." Elias understood then the final mercy of the trial. Nothing true had been taken. Everything false had been burned away. Evening winds stirred the cottonwoods as riders began kneeling in a great ring around the spring. Hundreds now. Settlers too, awkward but sincere, removed their hats. Elias stood in their center stunned by silence heavier than applause. Then Ayanna leaned close and spoke the quietest twist of all. "My father has one gift left unoffered." Elias turned to her. "What gift?" She looked toward the valley, then back into his eyes. "A kingdom needs two guardians." And for the first time, the lonely rancher understood the story had never been only about him. Evening settled over the sacred valley with the slow dignity of old scripture, gold light drifting across the spring where the 7 stones held their long silence. No one moved for a time. The kneeling riders remained still. Settlers stood, bareheaded. Cottonwood leaves whispered above them as though the valley itself had exhaled. Elias looked at Ayanna after her words and found no challenge in her eyes. No ceremony rehearsed, only quiet truth. A kingdom needs two guardians. The sentence lingered larger than marriage, larger than romance, carrying something older and steadier. He thought of the fire, of the leather box she would not release, of the tests that had stripped him down to what remained when ownership, reputation, and certainty had all been offered up. At last he understood. The kingdom had never been something given to a man. It was something shared by those willing to carry its burden together. Chief Dakota stepped between them and drew from his belt a braided cord worked in turquoise and silver. "My people bind alliances with witness," he said, "not with conquest." He placed the cord across Elias's hands and Ayanna's together, not tying them, only letting it rest. Choose freely. That is the only oath worth trusting. Elias looked toward the valley spread below, the springs glinting in dusk, the old ranch trail winding beyond the mesas. For years he had believed loneliness was protection. Yet every turning of the past days had led him not toward possession, but toward belonging. He did not make a speech. Men in the Old West who meant things rarely did. He only closed his hand over the cord and said, "If she will have a stubborn rancher beside her, I will help guard what ought not be bought." A smile touched Ayana's face, small as dawn and stronger than proclamation. Around them no one cheered. Instead, one by one, the riders lowered their heads. Felt holier somehow. In the weeks that followed, federal ratification came. The Sacred Valley was recognized as protected trust land jointly stewarded by the 7 clans, with Elias named intermediary guardian under treaty law older than the railroad charters that had tried to erase it. Bellamy left the territory before winter, undone less by defeat than by a truth no ledger could bend. Judge Mercer retired and often claimed his finest ruling happened under open sky, not in his courtroom. Eleanor Pike kept the ranch deed framed above her hearth. Until Elias took it back, though he changed the sign at the gate. It no longer read Boone Ranch. It read Wayfarer Spring, water free to any traveler. Years passed. Drought came and went. Children of settlers learned Apache place names. Apache riders traded horses in Silver Creek without suspicion. A schoolhouse rose near the creek where 2 languages were taught beneath one roof. Folks later called it peace, though old men who had seen harder times called it something rarer. Memory healed. As for Elias and Ayana, some said they ruled a kingdom. They would have laughed at that. They kept no palace, only a stone house near the spring where smoke rose each morning and horses grazed under cottonwoods. But when disputes came between tribes and towns, people rode there for judgment because both listened before speaking. That was their crown. One winter evening many years later, an old Elias stood beside the 7 stones with a grandson at his side. The boy asked if the story was true, that hundreds of warriors once knelt to crown a rancher. Elias smiled toward the water. No, he said, they knelt to honor a promise kept. Then he pointed to the first stone where Jonah Boone's old symbol caught sunset fire. Remember this, he told the child. Out here, justice does not always ride with guns. Sometimes it arrives as mercy, tells the truth, gives up what it loves, and returns as peace. When he finished, wind moved through the valley just as it had the day the riders first appeared at dawn. And in that fading light, one could almost believe kingdoms were never built from gold at all, but from ordinary souls brave enough to refuse ownership and choose each other instead.